Dear God, literally every scene with Doran in it is absolutely wonderful. I just adore him so much. Hello, interwebs! I'm here to review the latest episode of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, episode 5. And I am so ecstatic to say that after last week's episode, where I was mostly negative on this show, this episode was just a distinct improvement. I actually had a lot of fun with this one. That is not to say that this was by any means a perfect episode, nor that there aren't some still ongoing problems that I continue to have with this series. But this episode was just one that I think added a lot that I felt has been missing of the past couple episodes of the show, namely a lot of tonal variation and kind of fun being in this world. Most of the stories outside of the Doran and Elrond stuff in this show so far have felt kind of tonally flat and kind of felt just kind of straightforward and perfunctory in terms of like just the characters doing things. And it has made for a little bit of a static feeling show, especially tonally. But this episode actually finally allowed that to play a little bit more. And finally we get to see this show have a little bit of fun with its characters to feel a little bit more fully formed people and a little bit more fleshed out. Outside of the Doran and Elrond scenes, which have always been genuinely just fantastic in my mind. Like, we're starting to see that seep into the rest of the series, and I'm really, really pleased with that. My biggest problem with last week's episode, if you watched my review, and I was surprised other people liked it, which I'm really glad for. If you loved last week's episode, that's awesome. It was my least favorite episode of the series, and my biggest reason why was I really felt the hand of the writer throughout the entire storytelling. I just could see like a writer in the writer's room sitting being like, well, I need this scene to happen, or I need this character to be here, so I'm just gonna kind of like fudge things a little bit, or like push this character to make a little bit of a weird choice, so I can get to this moment that I really kind of want to happen. And as a result, because I could kind of just see the hand of the writer in the situation, instead of it being something that naturally came out of the story or the character's motivations, it just ultimately really, really frustrated me. And none of that really, for the most part, is felt in this story. And so just because of that, I was like, okay, I really am really just hooked into like the characters' motivations, where everyone's at in the story, and just the things going on, and also just the characters feeling like real people. Like, it all worked for me. Again, I'll get into some critiques in a moment, but let's kind of break it down piece by piece so I can get into those specific things. Let's just start off with the storyline that has always been an absolute pleasure front to back, and that is Elrond and Doran. I loved getting to see Doran being in the Elven land, and him sort of going up against Gil-galad and being like, this table is so important to my ancestors, and the elves kind of like being like, well, we want to maintain good relationships with him, like, here, yes, I will give you the table, we will honor you. And it speaks to like the elves like actually still being like kind of full of themselves, but actually still like good people who want to maintain good relationships with the people in Middle Earth. But I loved the twist at the end that Durin was just fucking with the elves and needed a new table for Disa. Like, I just love the playfulness that the writers are able to find with his character and dwarves in general, and it just so fits. And I love Elrond just kind of being his friend, like, you were fucking with us, weren't you? And that also coming around in also a more tangible way, with the storyline going on with Elrond kind of being torn in his loyalties between his loyalty to his friend and to his people, where we learn that there's this rot growing within the tree, and Mithril might be the thing to save them, and that save all the elves, and that it actually just a nice little reference there to the Silmaril. Mithril comes from the light of the Silmaril, and just a nice, like, my nerdy self, like, oh, they said Silmaril, that's so fun, that's just a nerdy Tolkien thing. And so that push and pull with Elrond between his divided loyalties was actually an intriguing one to see. My only real knock against this storyline is that it seemingly is resolved pretty quickly. I honestly would have liked to see Elrond be a little bit more tortured by it, or Doran kind of push back against him a little bit more. But then again, that may come next week, where we have Doran and Elrond going up against Doran's father, who may not be so magnanimous towards the elves. I think there's some more drama and some more tension that can be mined out of this story, no pun intended, and that still may be the potential. But what I ultimately did really love is the scene between Elrond and Doran, where Doran's like, whose hand is it in? Yeah, it's in my hand. It's in my hand. I can save the entire elven race. You know what? I guess I'll do it for you, my friend. Like, legitimately, that was very sweet and wonderful. So, pretty much, like a complete 9 out of 10 with all the stuff going on with Elrond and Doran. Moving into a story that I found to be probably a little bit less interesting, but still vastly improved over previous weeks, let's go over to Numenor. This storyline was greatly increased in several cases. I found Galadriel to feel much more like a fleshed out character, namely because we actually got to see her have fun this episode. Like the sequence where she's like teaching swords to the men and like how to do all those things, and Elendil sort of saying like, I'll promote any man that can touch her and can beat her, I thought was like just added a little bit of like, oh, she's a person who can actually enjoy things and isn't like dour sad woman all the time. I thought was just a necessary bit for her character. And it also allowed Halbrand to kind of smile a little bit here too. And it kind of pushes his character a little bit more to sort of have this thing like, do I take up the sword to try and save my people? Do I want to wear this crown? Again, it's sort of very much echoing Aragorn. And I really think that they are still setting him up to take a left where Aragorn took a right in the Lord of the Rings. That he'll either, like I said, turn into one of the ring race, or he might be Sauron himself. Like there's so many angles that they could take with him that I think they're setting us up for a more dramatic and saddening turn for his character in the long run. But again, because we get to actually see moments of him getting to be a person here, I am struggling with that. I do think that it ultimately lends credence towards that dramatic and probably sad end that he will ultimately face. So good on that front. I also enjoyed, to a degree, the stuff between Elendil and Isildur, with Isildur sort of like wanting to join, you know, the movement to go to Middle-earth, and his father not really letting him. I thought their conversations were all pretty decent, and I was actually invested in them. However, while I've been mostly positive so far, I will say two things. I don't really find the ancillary characters in this Numenor story to be all that interesting. Like, there's the, I don't even remember their names, which is unfortunate, which the guy who was like the young kid who was like dating Isildur's sister, who is like trying to say like, we shouldn't go to Middle-earth, like how does it protect Numenor, this very like isolationist dude. And I like at least seeing that there's some complexities with the sort of second in command of Numenor, basically saying like, look, I don't really like elves either, but we can still open this up to like trade. We can have men on Middle-earth OS. Like that's a little bit of nuance to the situation and like gradations of the politics of everything going on that I found interesting, but I don't really care too much about that character, so much that I don't like remember his name, nor do I care about his romance all that much. And so it's a nice sort of adding complexity to the politics of Numenor, but not in a way that unfortunately I'm able to grab into emotionally and in a good story. It's like, it kind of, you know what it kind of reads like? It kind of reads like the Silmarillion itself, where it's not really a story, it's like a textbook. And that element of this really feels like a textbook. It's like you can be like, there were tensions at this time with these types of people believing this, and this. They're just not characters that I really feel a full attachment to, and it feels very rom-com-y in some senses and very perfunctory in others. And then the second thing to say about this, and this is somewhat rectified by the end of the episode, is that the pacing of this stuff is just very, very slow. We still have not left Numenor after like 3 episodes of talking about it, and finally we are at the end of this episode. So that's sort of a knock against the series as a whole, slow pacing, and hopefully one that will be rectified moving into next week. The next bit of story that I actually liked a little bit better, but still not as well as other parts, was the Arondir and Theo and Bronwyn storylines, which I thought were vastly improved over last week, where I really did not like the forced conflict with Theo getting caught by the orcs stuff. Here, I liked that we got to see, again, some tension coming out of the characters having to make decisions about, like, do we side with Sauron or Adar, as we now know who is not working for Sauron, or at least supposedly isn't, given what we see in this episode, or do they try to stand their ground? And I like that divided loyalties and tensions, and it going back to the whole thing that these people once worked for Sauron and Morgoth years and years and years ago, which is why the elves were guarding them in the first place. So it just sort of speaks to these internal tensions within this group that makes sense, as opposed to like some of the forced stuff we saw last week. So I really liked seeing that, and the sort of dark scene where Adar sort of says like, look, to this guy, like, you need to sign this in by blood. It feels very dark magic-y, and I liked the darkness of that. I thought that was great. I liked the conversation between Bronwyn and Arondir, and I liked that Theo also trusted Arondir, and then we started to learn more about the sword that he has that might be this key towards something, might be this weapon that Adar needs. It's kind of a MacGuffin thing. I liked learning a little bit more about that. I guess my negative comes from I just don't like the MacGuffin of it at all. And Lord of the Rings itself is a series based all upon MacGuffins. Like, it's literally in the name. The ring is literally a MacGuffin. I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that this sword kind of came out of nowhere. And just like was dug underground somewhere, and now it's this wildly important thing. Just the coincidental nature of it being here is ultimately what I'm bucking against. And I guess that's not really a problem with this episode. I just hate that it's given like increased importance within this. So I don't mind MacGuffins, but I like MacGuffins to feel a little bit more natural than this. But I guess that's not a fault of this episode, just something that I'm like, I just hate that, like, oh, we need to protect them from this thing. But otherwise, I thought that this was a much more interesting setup. And the characters, again, I liked the push and pull in Bronwyn and Arondir for fighting each other, but actually having like feelings for each other. Some of the staging in this was a little bit weird though, because you do have like Bronwyn and him sort of like arguing in the middle of the courtyard about like going to side with these people. I'm like, if you need to build up confidence, that is not the way to do it in front of your people. Like, that's an argument behind a closed door that you have while you discuss this sort of thing. So some of the staging choices I thought were a bit wonky on that front, but generally a decent enough storyline. And then the final storyline that I'm a bit more just kind of neutral on, not hating but not loving either, is the stuff going on with Meteor Man and the Harfoots. I like seeing the cruelty of the Harfoots a little bit more, where they're like, people are like, look, just leave them behind. Come on, it's always that Meteor Man's fault. Like, I'm damn, like the Harfoots are cold. And a lot of people I saw commenting like, wow, a few episodes ago when the Harfoots like, we left these people behind, and people saying that's dark for the Harfoots. The Hobbits would never do that. I'm like, no. That kind of fits the Hobbits. Like, if you remember the Hobbits back in Lord of the Rings, and even the Hobbit as the book a little bit, you got to see that the Hobbits complain about other people and sort of like tell tales about other people and be a little bit like self-important and self-interested. And the Harfoots are not that far, but it does showcase like an evolution of that idea that like sometimes they will leave people behind, and I like that their culture sort of allows that. And so I seeing that in here, that there's a little bit of a darkness beyond in their cultures, not just all hunky-dory. And so I thought that was just an interesting thing to add into here. The reason I'm sort of neutral on the rest of this storyline is just because a lot of it kind of seems fairly, I don't know, it just seems fairly like, yeah, this is kind of where I expect this storyline to go, where we have the Meteor Man sort of like learning to be good, but he might be bad, so he does like, he helps them, but it might end, he also hurts Nori, and so there's like this question of like, am I a good guy or am I a bad guy? And it's sort of like playing into the show, sort of like trying to have it both ways. We don't know if this guy's good or bad just yet, and so I can just, the storyline seems to like write itself, and it's not doing anything particularly unique or interesting. Not bad, but just not unique or interesting. So I'm intrigued, but it just seems to be spinning its wheels a little bit more than it is progressing forward. I will say though that my theory that this is Gandalf is just giving greater increase. I mean, number one, he's using magic, which again, you could be something like Sauron or something, but it does sort of lean towards he's Gandalf. And then the second thing is the song that we hear at the beginning of the episode, like the Wandering Days song that the Hobbits sing, says literally, not all those who wander are lost, which is a line that Gandalf says to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. So I'm just sort of like, oh, that's where Gandalf got the phrase from the Harfoots, because he learned it from them, which if that's the case, I actually kind of like that like Gandalf learned this phrase from the Harfoots, who are ancestors to the Hobbit, and then he ends up telling it back to a Hobbit to inspire the Hobbit. I thought that that's a cool little note, but that just sort of leaned into like, oh yeah, that's probably Gandalf, isn't it? Just on that little piece of clue that we got there. But who knows? They could still play with that, but I think that just sort of adds a tally into that column. Long and short, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to discuss. Like I said, this was a good episode. I don't think it's by any means a fantastic 10 out of 10 perfect, but vastly improved over last week's episode, and one that I just generally enjoyed watching, even if it wasn't, you know, perfect by any means, and still saddled with some of the baggage that I am feeling with a lot of this series just structurally overall. But I enjoyed it. I liked it, and that makes me very happy. I am happy to come out of this one pleased with an episode as opposed to being negative on it like I was last week. So, what were your thoughts on The Lord of the Rings of Power? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments below, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's coming next week. But beyond all of that, I hope you all live long and prosper, my friends.